Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Mortgage Tech Talks. A lot going on this week. We got new mortgage rules. We're going to quickly chat about that. But then we're going to quickly transition into what's happened this week. I guess maybe a bit more personally, we went to the Canadian Mortgage Summit, which was phenomenal. Also, Globe and Mail published their top growing companies lists. We're talking about both those stories and how they kind of relate a little bit, not so much. It's a little bit of a stretch to get there, but we're going to try and make that work in this episode, the connection between those two stories. And then finally, to wrap up, we talk about, hey, more shakeup at the executive level at top mortgage tech companies, what I think this means and what you need to be paying attention to as it relates to that. So a lot to unpack in this episode. You're going to want to check it out. See you on the other side. Truth maybe is that every time you put a document in an email, that is the most vulnerable place. Welcome back to Mortgage Tech Talks. A lot going on this week. Let's get right into it here. After I recorded last week's episode, I think like maybe a minute afterwards, these new stress test regulations came out. Again, if you're living under a rock, what it says is at renewal, if you are switching lenders, you no longer need to go through the stress test, right? Of course, if you stayed with the same lender, it was always the case where you never had to go through the stress test again, just to continue on the amortization path that you were on, just renewing the term. But now with these new regulations, it says, okay, well, if you're going from lender A to lender B, you don't have to go through that stress test again. So it was a big deal. I think it's, of course, something that's good for the industry, good for the consumer, a little bit more risk for sure, but what you're getting out of that is a lot more competition. Competition's great. Great for brokers too, especially now there's a bit more incentive to, I think, really take care of the client in the renewal, making sure they're getting the best rate, best option, best mortgage, all good things. I thought about it for, 10 minutes here, trying to say, okay, what's the tech angle on this? I'm going to say no tech angle. I just wanted to kind of mention it, get it out there. Not everything has to do it. And I mean, this one here has a lot to do just more on the regulation side. And I think that's okay. Not everything has to be completely tech related in this industry. I think a lot of things aren't, right? Still, maybe that'll change as time goes on. More and more tech will get involved. But at least for now, it's just an interesting headline. So let's go away from there and let's try and get into some more interesting tech related things. So this past week, I think this publishes a week later, so it's going to be 2 weeks ago if you're listening. It was the Canadian Mortgage Summit in Brampton. It was great, fun time. It was pretty crazy. I think at the peak of it, they had like 1,500 people. People were like parking on the lawns. People got in and said it was a war zone out in the parking lot. We got there early, so we didn't have to deal with it. But yeah, ton of people there. Great event, a lot of fun. I was fortunate enough to get onto one of the panels where we talked about AI. And I want to tell a bit of a story about it. AI, of course, the biggest buzzword of our time, it seems right now, and I think for good reason. But let me tell you this story because I think it's a good one. And I think it reflects some of the things I've talked about on this podcast. So yeah, before the panel, little inside baseball, which is actually not too much of a secret. You probably could guess it. We always do a pre-panel thing. Everyone gets together and says, okay, what are we talking about? Let's not make sure we're stepping on each other's toes. Let's make sure we're not going to say something that's going to contradict the next person in a meaningful way. It's okay to disagree, but let's just kind of get on the same page here. So we had that call and it was great. And a lot of our questions, the panel is about technology and AI. And so I said, okay, what are some of these technologies that you're using with AI and what's the future and all the stuff you'd expect? And we're kind of talking about it, doing that sort of stuff. And then about halfway through, it was some on the panel, Dong Lee, who's now with Axiom Scarlett. That's their product, Axiom Innovations. He's the CEO there now. He kind of said, I was just in the States and I was at a mortgage tech conference down there. And honestly, a lot of the shine, I guess you could say, about AI has kind of come off. People last year were so excited, but this year, I didn't hear it as much. And people are honestly getting a little bit maybe exhausted from hearing that over and over and over again. And it was hilarious because there's about 4 or 5 other people on the panel, including myself, all completely jumped on. Like the energy of the call just picked up and said, I completely agree. And we kind of had a little discussion about that. And it reflected, maybe not to the same degree. We kind of found that happy medium on the actual panel. But I think it was just interesting to hear that, hey, we've talked about this on this call where AI is a very interesting solution right now, but you can't be solution oriented. You have to be focusing on the problems. And at least right now, there's not a ton of, I guess, problems out there that are very well solved by AI. And I think that reflects, part of the panel, and we talked about this for anybody who was at that conference, was they said, how are you actually using AI right now? And there are some solutions. And the ones off the top I'll list are 1, helping to draft emails, 2, helping to summarize notes, and number 3, this is a cool one, especially for deal submission platforms like Filogix and Scarlet, having a note summary. So, okay, I'm about to submit to the lender. I want to, of course, summarize what this file is. They can kind of pull through, the different details of that file and actually put together a nice summary, which is, I think, the most popular tool. But, I thought to myself, I said, well, all three of those things I could do in ChatGPT. All you're doing is you're taking ChatGPT and you're just putting it in my app, which is useful, of course, just integrating it together. But no one got up there and said, hey, a lot of brokers are doing this tool that writes a song for them and then sends a song to their clients. That stuff's not happening yet. That goes into the bucket of very cool solution, very, very cool solution, but it's not solving a real life problem. The real life problems that are being solved by AI are mainly just done by ChatGPT. And I love ChatGPT, of course, but it's really, interesting to see there. So, just a bit of a summary to wrap that up with that panel, both in the pre-call, maybe a bit more, but also in the panel. People were actually a lot more focused. Let's not look at the shiny objects. And there's a lot of shiny objects. There's a lot of noise out there. Let's not focus on those things. Let's focus on the practical things that people can use today. And let's not get distracted by those other things. But of course, I think, again, in both places, we said, but stay curious, because in about 10 years, AI will be used heavily. We just don't know which one it is yet. And at least for now, there's a lot more noise than there is signal out there. So pretty cool to kind of see that and to say, okay, these things that we're talking about on this podcast here are really, I guess, shared views in the industry. All right, we're going to story number 2 here. Story number 2, it's a little bit biased, I admit, but I couldn't help myself. Last week, the Globe and Mail published their list of the top growing companies in Canada. So for anybody who missed that, I think it's about 500 companies, and it just publishes the list and says who's growing the quickest. Coming in at number 1 was Neo Financial. Congrats, Neo. I don't know those guys personally, but if anyone there's listening, congratulations. I spoke with them once, actually. But no, very, I think, well-deserved. I think they had like some crazy 38,000% increase. Like, it was just insane. But no, that's great. And, of course, Neo Financially just struck a deal with DLC. We talked about Neo on this podcast before. They're doing a lot of good stuff. I mean, I can't say anything too specifically, but that's kind of been my experience with them. But other items on the list, other people on the list to go through. And this is why I was biased. We actually BluRoot came in at number 103. I have some other ones written down here, so I'm just going to go through them. So that was great. CMI Financial came in at 119. Amber, which I met for the first time at the trade show last week, I'm at 188. Pineapple, the brokerage, 242. Access Law, 356. And then Home Equity Bank, 399. With all those there, I mean, it's an interesting thing just kind of seeing how our industry is still growing despite maybe a bit of a slower couple of years. Still a lot of innovation happening. But, to bring it back, and I don't think this is trying too hard or too much of a stretch, when I do look at each of those platforms, tech is a big part of it, right? The founder of Neo came from DoorDash, which is a tech platform. So clearly that's their whole thesis, is that, a tech-powered bank. Look at ourselves, we're a tech company, of course. But even other ones, Pineapple, if you look at their description on this Globe and Mail list, they say it's a tech-powered brokerage. Access Law, they did the same thing. Of course, they've worked on closing. They help you with closing your real estate transactions, but they've completely made a pivot to be very tech-focused. So what does this mean? Does it mean, hey, if you're going to use tech, you're going to grow? Not necessarily, right? So I think this is the important kind of logical way to think about it, is to say, tech doesn't mean you're going to grow, but if you go the other way, all the companies that have grown are using technology, right? So technology is going to enable you to scale. It's not going to make you scale. It's not going to get you there. But if you want to scale, if you want to get to, some of these companies that are on this list, if you want to get to that level, tech does need to be part of it. It's not going to be the only thing. It's not your golden ticket that if you do implement tech, whatever that means, right? There's 1,000 ways you can do it. But if you use technology, you are going to grow. But it's more the other way around to say, if you want to grow, you need to use it. So I thought that was just an interesting point. Great shout out to all the people who made it, all those names, and everybody else, of course, who made that list. It's great to see the industry doing well. And just a small kind of tech takeaway from that is that, a lot of them are quite tech focused. So I think that's interesting. And the only other thing I'll maybe say about this, which I thought was cool, I just kind of quickly thought about, is almost all of those. I think Neo is actually the only exception. I was actually also at the trade show last week. So maybe that's the other thing. It's invest in technology and go to trade shows. Maybe those are the two recipes for success. I don't know. But I thought that was just kind of like an interesting tidbit. I was doing this story about the summit, the Canadian Mortgage Summit, the conference, and I was doing this about growing companies. I said, wait a sec, there's some overlap here. So I thought I'd throw that in there. My third big story of the week comes from Lendesk. We've talked about Lendesk/Finmo a couple times more from the product side, more technical side of things. Of course, they're a tech company that we work with closely. And they announced last week that their CRO, I believe was his role, Greg Williamson, is no longer with the company. Now, I don't know the details of this. I know some of the folks at Lendesk, I haven't chatted with them about this. I think it was fine. On their Instagram, it says, hey, the entrepreneurial bug has bitten again, and Greg's kind of doing his own thing. And so I think that's great. I bring this up just because I think two things. One is that it just kind of continues that trend I talked about last week, where there's some movement kind of at the executive levels of these tech companies. Last week, we talked about Jerry Lowe kind of coming in as the CIO of M3 Tech. So there was movement there. Now we're seeing movement that's in Montreal. So now we're going across the country at Lendesk there in Vancouver. Similar type thing. Though these tech companies, there's some shakeup at the executive level. So just interesting to see. I'm not really reflecting on it yet. It seems like it was very much so a personal choice. So I'm not drawing any conclusions about the company or the industry or anything about that coming out of this action. The second point that I'm making, or I think that is interesting, is how is Lendesk/Finmo going to respond? Now that's where we should really be paying attention to. Again, this was a personal choice. Let's not read into too much, but how do they respond, right? Do they go maybe for an inside hire, maybe someone who comes up through the ranks, maybe switches over? Do they kind of not backfill it specifically, but let other people kind of take over? And I think based on that response, we actually are going to learn a lot, right? If they bring in someone to come in and, really lead in a certain way, I think that's going to give us an indication of, which way the company is going, and in a more broad sense, which way mortgage tech is going, at least from their perspective. So I'm really eager to see that. I don't think we're going to get an answer anytime soon. It usually takes months and months to kind of get these things going through the pipeline all the way through. But I think everyone who's interested in mortgage tech should pay attention to that, because that's going to tell us a lot. All right. I think that more or less wraps it up. Yeah, a couple things going on this week. Just to recap, one, the stress test not being mandatory on a switch. Not so much a tech angle, but something good to know. Number two, talking about the AI panel is a great time. Thanks again to the whole Key Media, the Canadian Mortgage Summit. It was a great time. And just talking about how the panel there was a lot of fun, chatting with other people, hearing their thoughts about AI, and knowing that actually, hey, this whole concept of a lot of noise out there, but what's really the signal that comes from AI, it's not so clear right now. So it's cool to kind of get that perspective and see it there. Number three, coming out with a list of top growing companies, a ton of people in the mortgage space, which was great to see. And a lot of them, if not all of them, are pretty much tech enabled. I would say they're tech first. And this is the more of the joke, they had a trade show. But I think that's an interesting thing to say, okay, well, that's really, I think, what it takes to succeed maybe in this space right now is to network and to lean into technology. I think that's a great summary. And then finally, of course, coming out of Lendesk, Greg Williamson, who was there from the beginning. I've had many conversations with him. He's decided, seems to go kind of his entrepreneurial route, which is, I think, great for him. And I'm going to be looking very, very closely at Lendesk, how they respond to that, what they're going to do. And I think that's going to tell us a lot. And so look out for that. So that wraps it up today. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope this was useful. If you do have any feedback, leave it in the comments. But until next time, have a good one.